Good evening. When does the afternoon end and when does the evening begin? Is it 6 o'clock? The evening begins at 6 o'clock? Is there a formal rule about that? No one really cares. It's good afternoon and good evening. All right, please, as we are engaging, please eat. There's food here, there's drink here. We don't want to take any of it home with us, so please feel free to get up. We're going to talk, grab something to eat, get something to drink, and fellowship together. My name is Robert Trent Benson. I'm the director of the College of Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies here at the VA. I am so pleased to welcome back home to the Woodson Emerson Mount, who is an assistant professor of history and faculty affiliate of the African Studies program at Wake Forest University. He is also a Woodson Fellow. And we were just talking about, well, past the present, I say present. He was a Woodson Fellow last year. It was a 2-year residential fellowship. He had to go back to Wake Forest this year. So yes, he's back at Wake Forest, but he's still a Woodson Fellow. Once you're a Woodson Fellow, you're always a Woodson Fellow. Okay, so we've solved that particular issue. All right, now, before I introduce Dr. Mount, I would just like to say just a few words about College of Woodson, who obviously we're named after, and obviously to introduce this series that we're having across this month, Black History Month. Each Wednesday, we will have a talk, an event around the 100th anniversary of Negro History Week, which became Black History Month in 1976. Of course, most of them, if not all of us, know that Carter G. Woodson was born in 1875, just down the road in Buckingham County, here in that geographical proximity, but more importantly, perhaps, the towering singular figure of Carter G. Woodson as a scholar, as an institution builder, marks him as a person for whom we are honored to be named after. He has given us many institutions, including the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915 is now the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH. Some call it the association. That's how I call it going forward. Woodson was an institution builder, ASALH, of course. He also established a Journal of Negro History, now a Journal of African American History. And with the great encouragement of ASALH President Mary Clark Boone in 1937, he helped establish the Negro History Bulletin. We know Dr. Woodson as the second Black person after W.B. Du Bois to earn the PhD from Harvard University in 1912. But more importantly, we will always be aware that Woodson's formative and first educators were enslaved, formerly enslaved. His mother and 2 of his maternal uncles were his first educators. And even as we are in this university space, we are honored to be named after Woodson. We are reminded too that Woodson spent very little time in higher education, about 1 year at Howard University and left university life completely in 1922. He was more interested in establishing a different type of education institution, a more populist, grounded, community-based education institution, grounded in our histories, our Black histories, in global context, our Black cultures, our ways of being, a type of Black study separate from the institutionalized Black studies model that we are familiar with in the 1960s, an earlier tradition of Black study. Carter G. Woodson embodies that older, more populist and grounded grassroots collective version of Black study. And that's what we're honoring today. We want to be mindful that even as we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Negro History Week, Black History Month, we are reminded that it is now a global phenomenon, and that Black History Month is commemorated all over the global Black day. In some places, like the United States and Canada, it's February. And other places, like The UK, the Netherlands, Ireland, that month is October. In Australia, it's July. In Australia, it's combined. It coincides with National Aboriginal and Islander Day. We know that various Latin American countries celebrate Black History Month, sometimes in coordination with more national-specific commemorative days. For instance, Colombia's Afro-Colombian Day May 21st, Panama's Black Ethnicity Day on May 30th, Brazil's Black Consciousness Day on November 20th. This is the spirit of Black History Month in a global context. And we are honored to be part of that global celebration tradition. So we are so honored to have Dr. Mount to join us. And Dr. Mount earned his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2018. Before he joined the faculty at Wake Forest, he taught at Auburn University. And of course, he is a Woodson postdoctoral fellow. The award was from 2023 to 2025. Is that right?
No, before it's 26.
Change back. Sorry. 2024, 2026. Okay, it's 2 years. So you're still 37. Yeah. Dr. Mount's research interests diaspora, slavery, and emancipation, Jim Crow, colonialism, American empire, the Atlantic world, racial capitalism, critical mixed race studies, Afro-Asian solidarity. He studies radical Black politics. He's also at the forefront of advancing a new field of inquiry that is largely known as Black Pacific studies. He describes this as a liminal state or site of global Blackness, where alternative formations of race, empire, and self-invention are imagined and contested alongside older notions established in circuits of Black Atlantic. His current book project is The Global History of Emancipation through Living Realities of Transnational Black Workers Jettisoned Back the World for a New Life in the Pacific. The tentative title of this forthcoming project is called Black Elsewheres, Slavery, Empire, Reconstruction, the Black Pacific, and revisits older historiographical debates surrounding American Reconstruction through an entirely new set of transnational archival sources. And collectively, these sources will reveal concrete plans after emancipation for a massive state-funded colonization program that promised to relocate over 5 million formerly enslaved peoples from the Atlantic world to America's nascent empire and embodied Philippines. By following the lives of ordinary Black teachers, chefs, artists, and sharecroppers as they migrated and attempted to enact this program, Dr. Mount's book promises to unveil the largely overlooked connections between the death of legalized American slavery and the birth of American overseas empire. His work has earned numerous awards and honors, including the 2022 Outstanding Graduate Mentor Award for his teaching and mentorship, and I believe that was at Auburn. And his more recent article, 2024 article, entitled Shall I Go? Black Colonization Plans to the Pacific, 1840 to 1914, won the Richards Prize from the Society of Civil War Historians for the best article published that year in the Journal of Civil War, of the Civil War era. Joining us and speaking to us today about Prodigy Woodson's time teaching in the Philippines. I imagine this is part of the forthcoming book project. It is my great pleasure to welcome back home to the Woodson, Dr. God Emerson.
Thanks, Robert, for doing some of the work that I'm glad I didn't do here in terms of Woodson's where Black history should be, right? And what Black history is. This talk is going to talk some about that and kind of assume that, but it's also going to think about the ways in which what has been done to Woodson's Black history in a lot of ways is what I've been kind of really concerned about in a lot of ways. So hopefully we'll take it that history is there, and this history is maybe a different one. So with fascism governing the American state, with masked agents murdering protesters, with fascists attempting to disappear 5-year-old children, with government officials arresting queer Black journalists, with the Department of War using drones to assassinate 4 Black fishermen, with right-wing Zionists expanding the occupation and genocide in Palestine, with an American dictator kidnapping a head of state for supposedly being a dictator, with wars and rumors of wars running rampant, and with anti-Blackness continuing to inform every second of every day of this year's Black History Month. There is absolutely no place in the world I'd rather be than right here, right now, in community with all of you, at the hallowed grounds, sacred space, Woodson. So I want to thank Professors Benson, Gaines, Bond, McDowell, sounds like an elite law firm or something like that. As well as Debbie, Randy, James, all the interns, and everyone for making Woodson this true refuge that it is in these troubled times. And in my larger work, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of a refuge, or in many cases, a lack thereof. And rather than imagine a refuge as a place of retreat, or as a place to hide from struggles we're engaged in, I've come to think of a refuge as a place to recharge, regroup, organize, and to plot our next moves in the spirit of Woodson, a fugitive pedagogy that he created. In my experience, the Woodson is one of the last remaining counter-hegemonic forces left in the American Academy, and I hope we all will continue to defend it with everything we have. So, as the supposedly United States of America prepares to celebrate its 250th anniversary, on the same year that Black peoples more properly celebrate the 100th anniversary of Black History Month, it strikes me as a good time to pause and reflect on what the American nation is and what its relationship has been to Black peoples and Black history. During its 250-year history, the American state has deployed its troops to 98% of all the countries on Earth. It currently operates over 1,000 military bases spread out across nearly half the countries on Earth. The U.S. empire has been fighting in one form of armed conflict or another every single year of its existence, except for maybe 17. If we count the ongoing war against Black people, the U.S. has never known a single year, if not a single moment, of peace. By any objective measure, the United States of America is the most powerful, vibrant, warlike, settler colonial slave society in the history of global empires. And it's not even close. And yet, each year since 1976, the head of this American empire, including Trump, we should note, has issued a presidential proclamation demanding to know what contributions Black peoples have made to this empire. I'll return to contributions as a discourse a little bit. So I'm hoping today we can try to unpack some of these paradoxes by exploring the history of Black history through the archive of Carter G. Woodson. And I'm hoping we can do that by looking oppositionally as opposed to sympathetically at the American nation and the master narrative it tells itself about itself, namely, it is a benevolent, just, and supposedly legitimate nation state. By centering Woodson's own conceptualizations of Black history vis-a-vis his experiences as a teacher within America's empire in the Philippines, I'm hoping we might be able to disentangle how we might narrate the history of Black history and the month that we so desperately need to celebrate anew and to reimagine. We often joke it's the shortest month of the year, right? But we rarely ask what would it take to make it the longest. And Professor Carr at Howard has this thing where he's saying Black History Month should be the blackest month of Black History Month, right? This is just every month of Black History Month, and this is the blackest month of Black History Month, right? This is making it the longest month. And so I hope we do a bit of that work today. So polemics aside, at least temporarily, I want to give you a sense of the more scholarly arguments here. Now, there's another iteration of this talk that is simply called Filipino Origins of Black History Month. As you can imagine, that is very popular in the Philippines, one there in a little bit, but it's not so popular yet in Black studies. And I'm curious about why. Maybe I'll convince you here. But whether I convince you tonight that Black History Month originated in the Philippines, or whether historians should even be in the business of talking about origins anyway. I'm hoping we can at least wrestle with the question in a few less obvious sort of ways. So the first question I want to kind of think about is what happens when you narrate the professionalization of Black history as an intellectual project by starting your narrative not from the Black Atlantic, but from the Black Pacific. The second question is what happens when we situate Black History Month not within the context of the American Academy or Woodson's later professional organizations, but within Woodson's early and less glamorous colonial experiences within the U.S. empire in the Philippines? And is it possible that Filipino children and their thoughts about colonialism, racism, democracy, feminism, and American empire might have some bearing on the development of Woodson's own intellectual journey, his decision to pursue Black history in the first place? And finally, might any of these lines of inquiry help us see Black history and the problems of Black History Month in a different way? At the very least, I'm hoping that perhaps by thinking transnationally and reimagining spatial, temporal, thematic kind of boundaries of the history of Black history, we might just be able to see the month as a little less parochial, a lot more radical, and a decidedly anti-colonial project that the American empire has long hoped to capture, dissipate, and diffuse. So as hopefully you all know about the fire, Shelton and Caleb, the fire, Woodson started his career as an ordinary K-12 teacher in the Philippines. But what you may not be familiar with is the particular Filipino context Woodson encountered there. From 1903 to 1907, he worked for what was then called, and what is now being, I would argue accurately kind of recalled, the Department of War. And here's Woodson's appointment letter to teach in the Philippines from the Department of War. His signature is there kind of at the bottom. Saying the quiet part out loud, this means that the American military occupation was so totalizing in the Philippines that Woodson's Bureau of Education was literally an organizational arm of the American military. Woodson quickly became aware of this and critiqued it. And this is not an anomaly. The colonial bureaucracy often betrayed its underlying ideology through its names and its word choice. So, for example, the Philippine Constabulary, the police, was part of the very revealingly named Department of Commerce and Police. I agree. As we all hopefully know by now, this only makes explicit the fact that policing, either in the Philippines or in the empire at home, has everything to do with advancing commerce, protecting private property, and shielding capitalists from what they always feared, a revolutionary proletariat. There's a great book, by the way, by Al McCoy called Policing America's Empire, which traces the origins of the modern American surveillance state to this exact moment that Woodson was in the Philippines. And there's also this amazing new documentary on Netflix by Nance Ford called Power, that also spends a good amount of time tracing the history of modern policing in the US, not only through slave patrols, I think we know that story, but through American empire in the Philippines. And there's the power. But the War Department, lest we forget, was not just a rhetorical device, it was actively engaged in a horrific, barbaric war against Filipino revolutionaries for the entire time that Woodson was in the Philippines. According to Filipino scholars, the American empire killed north of 1 million Filipinos, mostly unarmed civilians, in an attempt to thwart the Filipino independence movement. During the war, the military devised new torture techniques, including waterboarding, as seen here on Life magazine, new racial slurs that were first used against Filipinos, then against Haitians, and then most famously against the Vietnamese. This was all part of the U.S. attempt to transform the Philippines into what I call the wider book project, slavery-informed empire. And by that I mean an attempt to replicate and reproduce the technologies of slavery, the plantation scheme, through what we now call American empire. So empire as an afterlife of slavery. But before Woodson could confront this empire, he was first subjected to it in the form of a medical exam. In this record of medical and physical examination produced by the colonial bureaucracy, Woodson was loudly chastised in all caps, quote, "This certificate must not be executed by the family physician of the applicant," end quote. To ensure the presumed objectivity of the observer, The colonial state required that the medical exam would only be administered by, quote, some medical officer in the service of the United States, end quote. A friend working in the history of Black doctors, by the way. It's very interesting. So the state's own highly subjective evaluation of Woodson was deemed the exclusive side of objective truth regarding Woodson and his body. Indeed, all family, community, and interpersonal relationships had to be removed from the equation in order for Woodson to be fit for empire. Woodson needed to become rational, legible, individual, and indeed a fungible Black subject. In this way, naval alienation survived the legal end of slavery, and it survived the imperial processes like this. To comply with this injunction, Woodson was compelled to appear before the, quote, Army, Navy, Indian, or Public Health and Marine Hospital Service and submit his body to several dozen medicalized test procedures. The exam reveals much more about the colonial state, I would argue, than it does about Woodson. His body had to be quantified and its value precisely determined by an increasingly bureaucratic colonial state. While Woodson's physical, quote, degree of robustness, end quote, was somehow determined to be excellent, his, quote, speech as a proxy for his mental capacity was only characterized as good. As an agent of the state, the doctor's assessment held the rule, the weight of law. Reminiscent of enslaved Africans who were brought above deck in the Atlantic world and forced to exercise for their white overseers, Woodson was then compelled by the American government to, quote, hop on one foot at distance of 12 feet, end quote. This was supposed to ensure his fitness and, quote, agility. Knowing full well the ways in which horses, mules, and enslaved peoples had their teeth counted before purchase, Woodson was then forced to open his mouth, to have his teeth tallied and inspected to determine their utility, not for a private slaveholder, but for the American imperial estate. Unfortunately for Woodson, this examination quickly went from bad to worse. The future founder of Black History Month was forced to strip naked and present his 159-pound Black body to an armed white authority for further inspection. His testicles were grabbed to feel for any nascent hernia. His anus was examined for any sign of, quote, hemorrhoids, and his sexual history was probed to discover any hint of, quote, venereal disease. His Black body, the Black body, was deemed state property. Ironically, for a man so deeply attuned to America's color line, Woodson's own, quote, color perception was categorized by the military doctors as, quote, bad. And I don't think anyone else has remarked on this. This document is new. But it seems that the founder of Black History Month was at least partially colorblind. Far from insignificant, Woodson's unique color perception held robust implications in early 20th century America for the man who practically invented a color-conscious historical methodology. Woodson literally saw the world in a different way. Drawing on historian Michael Rossi's work, scientists and philosophers at the time were already hard at work trying to determine the exact ontological nature of color itself, not to mention the meaning of blackness as a racial category, or race and color an actual scientific material thing. Woodson's deviant colorblindness embodied a potentially disastrous epistemological chaos. The Enlightenment era's commitment to scientific rationality, modernity at large, needed objectivity. If Woodson and the history he would describe as Black history were subjectively allowed to perceive color and to see the world differently, both literally and figuratively, all faith in a singular, universal, rational truth might be rendered obsolete. Empire needed objective certitude. In this way, Woodson's subsequent Black History project was not simply a scholarly challenge, it was an epistemological threat. A true Black history was an existential crisis for Western modernity. Interestingly, women were exempt from this gauntlet of tests. Female teachers who were only allowed to teach if they were with a male family member simply needed to, quote, furnish a certificate from a reputable position, end quote. Perhaps this exception reflected patriarchal chivalry, where the rigors of empire building were presumed to be a manly endeavor. By not examining women, men within the state could imagine women were somehow shielded from this otherwise testosterone-fueled imperial project, even when they were often performing the same job. For Black women, however, this reprise from state examination likely would have come as a welcome relief. And I'm thinking here of Dorothy Roberts, Drew Perkins, Rowans, Harry Washington. The experimentation being done on Black women began during slavery, continued in the professionalization of the medical field, was rapidly accelerated at this time. Black women and Black families were doing everything they could to avoid the white gaze, avoid white sexual violence, and the very public working conditions that reigned in slavery. A safe home, a true private sphere, and the protection of family bonds, in addition to legal and political rights, were critical post-emancipation demands of Black families, early Black feminists. In the end, I think these tests and their double standards were an open admission that at the end of the day, the test didn't really matter. The process was what counted. A process rooted in certain sovereignty, authority, and precise control. The exams were ultimately a self-fulfilling prophecy and logic circular. The state existed to measure the things the state indeed necessary to measure. This imperial claim on sovereignty, authority, and absolute arbitrary power also mirrored the logic of slavery. The enslaved supposedly needed masters because masters needed the enslaved. For Woodson and other Black teachers in the Philippines, this illogical imperative was their first introduction to American empire, and it reeked of slavery. So when Woodson arrives in the Philippines, he is stepping into an active war zone. It's filled with both physical and epistemic violence. While the fighting was not particularly heavy in the area, in the area that he was in the San Isidro, Pocos Mountains of Luzon. There wasn't a lot of fighting there, but the fighting had spread to Samar and Mindanao. Mindanao later, Philippine origins by history. Resistance remained fierce, and to this day, Filipino revolutionaries continue to fight a Maoist insurgency campaign against the Filipino government and its neo-colonial, neoliberal practices, making it the longest-running communist insurgency in the world today. Since 1969, the Philippine state's attempt to crush the new People's Army has led to at least 40,000 additional deaths, top of a million. So the anti-colonial struggle is alive and well in the Philippines. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Woodson took an antagonistic approach to this American colonial enterprise, even as he cashed the checks from the War Department. Buried in plain sight on page 152 of The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson is very explicit about how his lived experiences in the Philippines not only convinced him of the need for Black history, but a counter-hegemonic approach to intellectual life in general. His journey to the Black Pacific started in the segregated train ride. He went from Chicago to the port city of San Francisco. Then on November 20, 1903, Woodson boards the SS Korea, bound first for Hawaii, another American site of the violence and empire, then to Japan, probably, and then finally to the North. Woodson remembered this journey took a month to get there as a floating classroom. On board, he met an unnamed white insurance salesman turned teacher whose educational techniques Woodson would soon deploy in educating Filipino children and later African American adults. Through this conversation with this veteran teacher, as well as later interactions with Filipino students, Woodson came to develop a healthy skepticism of even his own elite educational credentials and his pedagogical assumptions. This unnamed insurance salesman found success in the Philippines because, in Woodson's words, he, quote, understood people. Looking back on the encounter, Woodson cited this chance encounter as an epiphany. It was then that he realized that, quote, men trained in institutions like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Chicago, as well, could not reach Filipino students, end quote. In the Philippines, most American teachers, according to Woodson, quote, entered upon their task by teaching the Filipinos just as they had taught American children, end quote. According to Woodson and his mentor, a different approach was needed. Filipino students did not need abstract foreign concepts dictated by the American state. They needed an emancipatory education that addressed the tangible needs, the concrete political realities, and the lived social positionalities of colonized peoples. Material culture was a critical part of Woodson's shift towards a student-centered, pro-Filipino pedagogy. Woodson praised the fact that his mentor, quote, filled the schoolroom with thousands of objects from the pupil's environment, end quote. When told by the Bureau of Education to teach Filipino children the song, Come Shake the Apple Tree, for example, Woodson and his mentor refused on the grounds that, quote, their students had, quote, never seen such an object, never seen that. Instead, they had their students come shake the lomboy tree, this is the lomboy tree, and gather the dark purple duhat fruits that are particularly loved by Filipino children, because when you eat them, it turns your tongue like purple and whatnot, right? And so they switched it, right? So these are not apples, they're duhat. So give them duhat and then do the lesson, right? The colorblind Woodson, of course, might have experienced something quite different, seeing this color as various shades of gray. This visceral sensory classroom technique that Woodson and his mentor, quote, did not use books very much, end quote. This orientation went beyond material culture, however, and into the realm of history. Woodson likely followed his mentor and tossed out the state issue textbooks on the ground that, in Woodson's words, quote, those supplied were not adapted to the needs of the children. Black History Month would follow this same anti-colonial logic. We have stories of teachers, black teachers, hiding Woodson's book under the official state textbook is here. They take it out and hide it from the superintendent, right? It's exactly what's happening with the Philippines. So Woodson and said that he and his mentor, quote, did not concentrate on the story of how George Washington, or Washington, right, did not always tell the truth, end quote. Woodson's Filipino students had, quote, never heard of him, could not have appreciated that yet, even if someone had told them about it, end quote. Woodson being Woodson, he more likely told his Filipino students that George Washington was a slaveholder. Right? At the very least, one can't imagine him being enthusiastic about the state telling him to venerate George Washington to Filipino students. Instead, maybe Booker T. Washington actually had some evidence that Filipino students were reading Booker T. Washington's Up in Slavery, and I think I know who that came through. It might not have been Woodson, but it might have been. I don't have proof, but I know that we're reading Booker T. Washington. So, throwing Washington the dustbin of history, Woodson stood up in front of the classroom of Filipino students, and a move that might have cost him his job, he, quote, talked them about their own hero, Jose Rizal, one of the revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. This attempt to advance the anti-colonial national struggle among Filipino students in the face of American colonialism did Woodson and his mentor as employees of that occupying force eventually, quote, got rid of most books based on the life of American people and worked out an entirely new series dealing with the lives of Filipinos, end quote. After seeing the need for a Filipino history for Filipino students, Woodson's demand for a Black history for Black students makes perfect sense as an anti-colonial emancipatory project. Undoing the miseducation is what Woodson landed on in 1933. Filipino scholars would eventually follow suit, as Filipino historian Renato Constantino would later publish in 1966, surprise, surprise, the miseducation of a Filipino, keeping this Afro-Asian call and response going, right? While the intellectual genealogies of social history, post-colonialism, and subaltern study often pass through Fanon and Du Bois, we rarely invoke Woodson as a founding father of anti-colonial thought. Yet all of these methodologies were present in Woodson's teaching in the Pacific, and Filipinos knew it and on how to reproduce it. And Woodson was not alone. I've been able to identify at least a dozen other Black teachers in the Philippines, including, that's Rizal, by the way, the statue of Rizal, I forgot to agree with that. But the other Black teachers included John Henry Manning Butler, who knew Woodson personally. They were in correspondence. Butler's going to write the regional anthem of the Cagayan Valley. He wrote a phonics textbook to teach Filipino students how to read. It has tons of Black history, and making Filipino students read Paul Lawrence Dunbar, like poems and stuff, right? So I was teaching them how to read. So amazing figure. He's the second half of this chapter, actually. He's kind of what Woodson wanted to be about. He's a lifelong teacher in the Philippines. I'll prove that up in a second. One of the other teachers that's there is Frederick Douglass Bonner. He's a Yale graduate who taught us alongside his wife, Charlotte Stokes Bonner, who was one of the few women, Black or white, that was allowed by the colonial state to teach in the Philippines. She was with her husband. And so, yeah, the reasons behind, we'll move forward, we'll show. Okay, but what about Woodson students? Is it possible that this education was a multi-directional affair rather than one in which Woodson, Butler, and others kind of poured Black wisdom into empty Filipino vessels? Filipino students would say. Woodson himself, I think, would admit, would say that Filipino students had some mistakes. When you have Woodson making space for Black students to publish work in early parts of the journey, right? Now, I haven't been able to find any documents from actual students that Woodson directly taught in the Philippines, but I was able to find an archive at the University of the Philippines at Diliman, where one white teacher named Luther Parker, who taught just 30 miles north of Woodson, the village of Muñoz, in Woodson's area, he saved a huge number of documents from Woodson's region, lesson plans, textbooks, student essays, and it gives a really clear picture, I think, of the kinds of things that Woodson likely heard from his Filipino students. They were studying against the press. They were forming a pupil self-governing club. They engaged in collective community agricultural projects. And Woodson is later going to look back with envy on these Filipino projects, and he's going to bemoan the, quote, absence of a cooperative enterprise among the Negro peasants or proletariat, end quote. Woodson might have read an essay like this from J.M. Caldisi. Here, Caldisi promises to, quote, show candidly to the civilized world that the Philippines will build up and form a sacred altar of independence, end quote. Woodson, after reading this, might have asked if Filipino students can imagine an independent nation. Maybe Black peoples can too. Marcus Garvey was not far off the scene, and he would eventually, Garvey, send agents to the Philippines to explore the Philippines as a possible site of Black colonization across other parts. Woodson might also have encountered this essay from Felisa San Augustine on August 21st, 1904, wrote a truly remarkable work on Filipino feminism. This young Filipino schoolgirl soundly rejected the idea that, quote, a woman is considered to be a housekeeper only, end quote. She insisted that women should, quote, have the right to do everything as a man has, end quote. In fact, St. Augustine went further, arguing that, quote, the woman has more influence than you, end quote. And rhetorically asked her presumably white male teacher, quote, are you not born a woman? Turning the cult of domesticity on its head, St. Augustine proclaimed that, quote, a man will never live from youth to death without the care of a child. Without the care of a woman. Augustine proceeded into this extensive historical analysis of various women who had killed men in battle, including the biblical, I know the biblical scholar here, Judith, who beheaded Holofernes, as you can see in this 16th century Italian painting. She then wrote about Augustina of Aragon, who fought against Napoleon during his invasion of Zaragoza, where, according to her Filipino admirers, she, quote, manned the cannon and kept firing at the enemy, even when the strength and courage of man failed, end quote. We can only wonder how Woodson might have rated her essay, and what he might have taught her, and what she might have taught him. Hope we give her a name. It's also tantalizing to think that Woodson's Filipino students might have turned him on to feminist politics decades before he collaborated with Mary McLeod Bethune to do the Psalm. And if St. Augustine had lived long enough, she might have joined with the Filipino freedom fighters of the Filipino Communist Party, the Hook Rebellion. My dear sister, Lina Lozona, from the Philippines, has written about these Filipino revolutionary fighters. These women took up arms to end the Japanese internment in World War II and then rolled into the Maoist revolutionary insurgency that I talked about earlier. Could Woodson be part of that story? Neither did, right? I don't know the answer. But the very existence of these students' essays is just as problematic as they are historically exciting. The military dictatorship actually instructed its teachers like Woodson to gather this kind of intelligence from the thought of Filipino children. Students were forced by their teachers in their daily curriculum that Woodson threw out, right, to disclose in writing their traditional folk stories, their religious beliefs, their local customs. The hope was that these stories could be collected and used against the Filipino insurgency in a no identity sort of way. This assemblage of Filipino culture was part of a much wider project of colonial knowledge production the empire was engaged in. Soon, the US had a small army of professionally trained American anthropologists who were scouring the countryside looking for additional data for the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes. And teachers provided some, that's why I have that archive, actually. We would report all that stuff to the military. Armed with seemingly valid information, the Bureau then cataloged, photographed, and reported on it and made Filipinos legible for congressional reports, military operations, and a colonial regime intent upon knowing and containing them. So Americans were not giving education, they were taking information. Unless you think I'm exaggerating, making too much of this culture of observation, examination, surveillance, measurement, take a look at this picture. Anyone want to guess what's happening here? Who this is? It's collected by this Department of Anthropology for the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes. This man's Filipino. He's part of the Ateo group of peoples that the Spanish call Negritos, quote unquote. Anyone want to take a guess at this patch? It's on his chest, what it's doing, why it's there. I saw in the archive, I saw a couple of them. We figured it out. Flipped it over, and it said skin colored patch. The anthropologists, the American state, looking at Filipinos to see how black they were, how far away from whiteness were they, so that they could figure out how to subjugate what they're going to do with the Philippines. And the state ends up saying that half the Filipinos are quote unquote Indian. That's why the black colonization programs to the Philippines were advocated for. There's Emerson America, Emerson Philippines, yeah, wild stuff. But despite all this, Woodson found in the Philippines a better setup than Jim Crow America. And here I've got some new Woodson biographical details that I haven't seen anywhere else, maybe you have. But it should really cause us to rethink Woodson. After just 1 year in the Philippines, Woodson wrote to the Bureau of Municipal Affairs saying, quote, "We, elected, have decided to move our family there as a whole on condition that the government gives employment to 3 more of us," end quote. Woodson demanded government jobs for his sister Bessie and his brothers Robert and Edward. The Woodson family, it seems, wanted to be part of a growing black community in the Pacific, which is the real focus on wider book. The idea was to leave America behind forever, replace the trauma of the Atlantic with the uncertain waters of the Pacific. Contrary to the image of Woodson as a loner with no real family ties, this document proves he never married and had kids, but this document proves he wanted his loved ones with him and was using his teaching position in the rural island of Luzon as a way to create refuge for the empire at home, not just for himself, but for his entire family. The state and its whole bureaucracy, however, like it always does, facilitated the breakup of black families, not their togetherness. This request was denied, and his brothers were told to go through the same battery of tests that Woodson had endured and approach the imperial state not as a collective black family, but as atomized individual colonial subjects. His sister could be exempted from all the tests on account of her gender, but only if she listed Woodson as her patriarchal protector. All refused. No more evidence of Woodson's desire to stay in the Philippines permanently. There's more evidence here. Woodson's desire to stay in the Philippines a few years later. So in 1907, Woodson took a temporary break from teaching in the Philippines, up for 4 years. Then on the 4th year, he took a break, which is common for teachers to do this. And he traveled the world. I don't know if many of us know this. He went to India, went to Singapore, went to Greece, went to Italy, and he went to Palestine. He bragged to the War Department that he had, quote, made a special study of the school systems in those places, hoping to analyze British colonial techniques, bring back what was useful, also what was unuseful, adapted to the Philippines. He also studied, quote, as a special student of European history at the University of Paris. This positions Woodson, I think, as a bona fide black internationalist and part of this long line of black luminaries that visited Paris, also not in that box. Black internationalists seen as very domestic. So if Woodson wanted to leave the US for good and live in the Philippines, think about the implications of that, right? No Asala, no Black History Month, no Journal of African American History. If he wanted to do that, this whole family, why didn't he? And as many of you know, well, as many of you know, Woodson had chronic health problems. Issues of colorblindness, right? He was always, and after his world travels, he didn't. He spent much of in the 1908 recovering from illness and applying to grad school. After partially recovering, he enrolled at Harvard in 1908, late 1908. And then he tried to leverage that institutional status in 1909, not to do some scholarly stuff. He reapplied at Harvard to be reappointed in the Philippines. Harvard is just a landing pad for the community work, the anti-colonial work. He was willing to bounce on Harvard after 1 year to go back to the Philippines. And he wasn't quite well enough, he couldn't pass the medical exams. That's why he didn't go this first time. So he took his second choice, Harvard. This makes perfect sense if you know Woodson, right? He had disdain for PWIs. But after graduating from Harvard, surely then, right, he fell in love with the life of the mind, he had a change of heart, right? He became a bourgeois scholar like we all know, right? Wrong. This is Woodson's resume that he sent into the War Department in 1912, the same year he graduated Harvard, asking again to be reappointed after he graduated from Harvard with a 50% increase in pay. Now he's a PhD, give me more money, I want to go back to the Philippines. The American state, again, its bureaucratic logic, deemed this against protocol. They agreed to reappoint him after the Harvard PhD, but at the same salary, $100 a month that he had during his first appointment almost a decade later. I was confused. That's the last I got in corresponding. So, which brings us to this slide. So kindly put on the fire by Michaela. I thank you for that. What we're looking at here speaks volumes, I think, the complexity of Black History Month and its relationship to American Empire. This is the what did they do to Woodson kind of story. And I'd love to hear your read on this. This is a relatively new source for me. It was originally commissioned in 1943 by the U.S. military's Office of War Information. It was a propaganda arm of the American state during World War II. And it was intended for publication in Black newspapers and in Black magazines. And this is perhaps one of the first instances I know of where the American state is explicitly attempting to capture Black History Month, and in this case, New York History Week, and use it as propaganda in the service of American empire. So Woodson's already Woodson by this time. Before Cold War liberalism really took off, the idea of celebrating Woodson's Black excellence as a way to frame the U.S. as an inclusive society that had long escaped its ties to slavery was not only premature, but it was way ahead of its time. It's going to really take off after the Cold War, or after World War II, where the Cold War really heats up. Woodson's personal story of individual uplift was crucial to the military's war efforts to win the hearts and minds of the Black peoples of the U.S., and potentially non-white peoples of the world over. In America, Woodson had supposedly overcome his parents' slavery, as well as his hard scrabble upbringing, pulling him from his bootstraps up, going seamlessly from Virginia coal miner on the left, straight to Harvard PhD on the right, no Philippines. Right? But despite a segregated military and a segregated society, Woodson's good Negro narrative was supposed to assure Black people that he played by the rules, supported the American empire, you too could be part of Black American history. I'm going to talk. I can talk more about the authorship here, repeat on time. I'm a believer in democracy, right? So long or slow, I can skip a deeper reading of this and the context of this. Like a couple of pages. We'll skip. Because I'm still, like I said, this is a new source for me. Black, yeah. All right, we'll take the time. Yeah, this would be helpful, actually. There's no time for so we'll skip part of this, actually. And well, this is fun, actually. So for any white Americans that happen to catch wind of this collaboration between the Black press and the U.S. military, it assured them that everything was fine because there were many Woodsons out there. Now, this was part of a series of images that the U.S. military is cranking out with industrial precision. You've got Frederick Douglass, you've got E. Franklin Frazier, you've got an interesting diasporic twist because Edwin Barclay is there. Emperor Haile Selassie. So this is early Black history stuff, right? The USA is producing on a military industrialized scale. They are cranking this out like it's World War II, which it is. And for any Filipinos who might be susceptible to Japanese, Pan-Asian solidarity efforts, the inclusion of Black subjects into American history meant that anybody could be part of the glorious American nation. And lest that subtlety get missed, there was always this image by the same artist. This is part of that racist kind of attempt to get Black and brown people around the world to go against the Japanese, right? Because the Japanese were saying they're liberators, and this is an attempt to say Japanese are not liberators, we're the barbarous. The same artist working for the American military is producing this. So who would create such a thing? Some Army staff sergeant? Well, plot twist. Those with a keen eye might have seen the signature at the bottom of these posters and realize that the military commissioned none other than Charlotte-born, Harlem-famous Charles Alston for the job. After rising to fame during the Harlem Renaissance, Alston worked for the Works Progress Administration, painting murals on Black hospitals and Black insurance companies before moving to this role and creating propaganda for the war effort, including this famous one on the top right, the more mainstream one. He also, later in life, he's going to create this bust of MLK. And that bust was first brought to the White House by Clinton in 2000, and then it went into the Oval Office of Obama, and it was, of course, removed by Trump, right? So there's a whole story here about Alston, to be sure. Better for a 20th century person to handle that. But he did make one on this sort of his Harlem Renaissance work, right? So think about a body of this kind of work, right? Someone needs to do a number. I'm happy to share what I've got here because it's not exactly in my wheelhouse. It's a bit of a divergence with what's in store. But he did make one, Alston now did make one little move. I don't know if you can see it here. It's on the, Dr. Woodson, through his scholarly writings, is responsible more than any other singular person for familiarizing the American public with the contributions of the Negro to world history. Period. Not American history, world history. But with the Japanese occupying the liminal space of the Philippines, the Philippines legally was constitutionally part of America, but separate from America. And in the process of decolonizing from America, why did the Army feel compelled to say that Woodson, this other part of the thing here, it says Woodson, quote, taught near the spot where the first Japanese forces landed after Pearl Harbor. And as most of you hopefully know, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was only part of their operation, as they simultaneously attacked the Philippines and Guam in the name of liberating them from American colonialism. Pearl Harbor makes a ton more sense when you realize Japanese are also trying to do the colonial thing by getting the Americans out of these colonies. Now, Americans, in particular African Americans, were expected to be particularly outraged that the Japanese military would dare land their troops so close to Woodson's schoolhouse. I think you read the black paper, Woodson from the Philippines, and the Japanese were there. We got to fight. This is what they were trying to do. And I just have to know the American flag here on the schoolhouse, it's as big as the damn schoolhouse, right? I mean, this is like, lest you forget, this is nationalism doing its thing, right? So Japanese forces were not just occupying an American colony, they were defiling the nation's growing image of itself as a supposedly inclusive nation, ashamed to look at its reflection in Hitler's mere fascism. Which brings us back to fascism. Here's the conclusion, right? And to our present. So what has become of Woodson's Black history? While Black liberals, Black nationalists, Black feminists, and to a lesser extent Black leftists all deploy and invoke Black History Month in the name of advancing their particular Black political project, America is doing something entirely different to Black History Month. As far as I can tell, America has largely followed the logic of this World War II propaganda poster, trying to romanticize and capture Black History Month while transforming it into a liberal prop freely available for other people's use, other people's enjoyment, and other people's liberation. The difference is that now, in addition to the state, we also have the corporatized, brought to you by McDonald's version of Black History Month to contend. Like the Woodson poster, The narrative arc here is Whiggish, it's teleological, it's rooted in liberal integrationism that ultimately celebrates rather than critiques American empire and American capitalism. And critical to this process of inclusion and incorporation into the discourse is this idea of contributions. Contributions to what? Contributions to America, contributions to empire. Every year around this time, McDonald's and other corporate sponsors roll out by clockwork this highly curated parade of supposedly good Negroes, and we see you go. Black success stories must play by the rules, they must suffer nobly, contribute willingly to the wonderful multicultural tapestry of the glorious American nation. But we must never forget that Black History Month, as a contribution of contributions, was never intended by Woodson to strengthen America, but critique it. Yet America, true to its 250-year history, steals everything. We also have the discourse of celebration, which always becomes a celebration of America and its corporate brands. Here, in the master narrative of American exceptionalism, Black history becomes a minor oversight in the overall, always more perfect union of an American nation state built on freedom, equality, and justice for all. But what if, I'm borrowing from Thomas Coates here, slavery and anti-Blackness are not bumps in the road, but the road itself? Imagine that Black History Month thoughts. Such a thought is, of course, strictly forbidden. Because remember, we have to celebrate, compelled to fantasize about redemptive art. You're compelled to allow the struggles of the ancestors to be used, not for Black liberation, to inspire the American nation towards even more greatness in the future. And above all else, Black history must, despite all the evidence to the contrary, offer the nation hope. And if this seems too polemic, don't believe me. Just ask Walmart, whose marketers came up with a brilliant idea to roll out, kid you not, a Juneteenth flavored ice cream. Remember that? It was emblazoned with a mantra, quote, this is an injunction. Share and celebrate African American culture, emancipation, and enduring hope. Thanks, Walmart. And one of the things that we are supposed to be hopeful about is summed up in this pithy phrase. It's not just Black history, it's American history. Implication, of course, is that if something were just Black history, that it wouldn't be enough. That without America, Woodson's Black History Month is not enough. And I'm here to tell you, Blackness is enough. Woodson's Black history deserves so much better than America. America is not worthy of Black History Month. Its nation is not worthy, its state is not worthy, and its empire is certainly not worthy. So in conclusion, as a historian, deeply loves Carnegie Woodson, and has studied his archive with all my heart, let me leave you with this. Black history is not a part of American history. It is so far beyond it. It is so much bigger. It is so much more beautiful. It is so much more magical. So happy Black History Month.
We have questions, comments.
Thank you so much. There's so much for us to think about in your talk. Learned a lot. This is why we wanted you to come back for Black History Month.
Sorry, but really shouted to you.
Yeah.
I was worried about that.
So you were talking about how Woodson is trying to get back to the Philippines. And you said something in passing, if I heard it correctly. It had to do with Woodson trying to make the case by saying, oh, I've been all over the world. I've been through Asia, India, and it seemed like he was professing some kind of expertise about empires, and that he was trying to make the case that this would be useful for his continued service in the Philippines. Is that right? And if so, one of the things that I recall encountering in research was this early moment, and this, I guess, this is like 1908.
3 and 7.
Yeah, this early moment of the, before World War One, where there's a certain kind of transnational discourse around empire, and you have, sort of British, imperialists coming to the United States to study, race issues, and you have Americans. You got this sort of this discourse, and the point of the discourse is, how can we do this more humanely and efficiently? And I mean, that's their stated terms. And then Black intellectuals, the people that Cedric Robinson describes as boys and the other things, as having no place within this new imperial world. Their education and their status, just kind of disqualifies them. But nonetheless, you have these educated Black folks, even including Du Bois, who are interested in empire and early Pan-Africanism for Du Bois. It's really about trying to make a case for educated Black people or educated colonial subjects to have some kind of a niche within these systems of empire, with the argument that they were going to make them function better and be more humane. Could you just, where does Woodson fit within this sort of early moment? It's not anti-colonial. Du Bois takes a while to get to an anti-colonial position. But if you could, I guess I'm asking for you to place Woodson within this earlier historical moment when it's not clear that these folks are just purely anti-colonial. After World War I, they're going to be anti-colonial. But this is an earlier moment.
Right, it's a transition, and I think his experiences in the Philippines, I've got several other Black teachers, as well as both here as well as in Hawaii, go kind of like, okay, maybe I'll leave this kind of professional class within the empire, I can get a job, I can escape Jim Crow, I can be out there. And then many of them, right, like you said, in this course of getting, even before World War One, once they realize what's actually happening on the ground, many of them fled. Many of them come back disillusioned, many of them come back kind of writing things like, I can't believe this, and many of them start thinking about blackness in the US. They start seeing Jim Crow through a colonial lens because they were there and saw it. So Butler, I mentioned up there, is from North Carolina, for example. He would come back and he would say, the schools in North Carolina are worse than the schools in the Philippines. Jim Crow America, I'd rather my students be taught in the Philippines by me. We have better conditions there. So it's an awakening, right? It's this early awakening to what was going on. But the Black press was there early, though. Black press was probably there in 1903. This is Smoke Yankees by Gilrod. I mean, that book is, the Black press is very anti-imperialist during this moment. And the other thing I was going to, the folks might not know, is David Fagan. So David Fagan, right, is part of, we think at least, I've talked to the Filipino scholars on this, there's at least 24 Black soldiers who defect. So if you look at why Black soldiers go over, many of them say, I'm fighting an anti-colonial fight against the Spanish. I want to free Cuba from Spanish colonialism. I want to free the Philippines as fellow Negroes, fellow people of color. Got tons of stuff from Black soldiers saying it's a liberation, anti-colonial thing. Then they get there and they realize, oh crap, we're the bad guys. We're part of this thing. And David Fagan flips. He joins the Filipino revolutionaries. He hides out for the rest of his life. He goes back and fights the white Americans. That once he realized what was going on, Filipinos were very aware of this. Filipinos were dropping flyers and propaganda saying, hey, Black Americans, why are you fighting for the American Empire? And they do Hose. They do Sam Hose. The Filipinos are saying you're lynching Sam Hose. You're fighting for them. At least a dozen documented Black soldiers. And the Black intellectuals are doing the same thing. It was a much more, I don't know if you were getting that, maybe this was an elite-driven thing. The wider book will hopefully prove out that I've got sharecroppers, Arkansas, right into the American state to get me anywhere but Arkansas. Get me the closest place to the Philippines. Can't, I'll figure it out. broken English and share problems, right? So this was not just an elite kind of black internationalism, it's a very mixed kind of everybody trying to figure out what the Pacific might be. And everyone's coming all kinds of different things. Very few kind of pro-gay kind of stuff in the archive. There's a few little boosterisms from time to time that come join the capitalist humans, a little bit of that. But there's very few full notable activists that have time I've come close. But you're right, it's a
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the Black press at the turn of the century, some articles about the Philippines as a new frontier for educated blacks, for black elites.
Yeah, sometimes that does kind of depend on who's sort of writing, you know.
Yeah.
But it's been a lot of it. I mean, Booker T. Washington, for example, alive this time, he's actually behind some of that black colonization to the Philippines and stuff. One of the things he said was, well, how are Filipinos going to be classified here, right? And he said, well, for the sake of Filipinos, I hope they get classified as white. But for the sake of black peoples, I hope they get classified as black. Because I want a transnational solidarity. I want more black peoples in America. We can do something together. So you've got an early Afro-Asian solidarity thing, even with somebody like Booker T. Washington, who was looking at this, trying to get black people over there, trying to organize Filipinos. So it's complicated, but that's what you know how they're doing.
And then you have Jack Johnson.
Oh yeah, yeah. And Joe Lewis is a Philippines too, by the way. Joe Lewis.
Okay,
The restaurant of black
should we continue?
I will go on that. I don't trust my memory. But I'm thinking about Woodson going to the Philippines. He would have been 28, young, relatively young.
Yeah.
Was he not a principal at a school in somewhere in Virginia? And his uncle had run the school. He had run afoul of the Jim Crow code. And Woodson also had some trouble, just trying to teach Black history ways, but it was going against the curriculum assigned by. And the pay, he was attracted to the pay. It was like 4 times as much as he was making. So, some level of economic security and the chance to travel in parts of the world that it would be very difficult with needs ready. I think that was future motivation. And somewhere, it may be in miseducation, but maybe another, he has a sort of realization where he's referencing 2 things. He's referencing his time in the Philippines. At least in his first year, he was open, seduced, or not as critical of the empire, the project of the empire, and saw some ways to move through that and do some good work, right, in the schoolhouse, just stop. And came to realize that ultimately he could not do much good to counter this larger structure. He speaks of it somewhere that this was part of his unlearning, this process of unlearning. He counts the PhD at Harvard later as unlearning some of the intellectual scaffolding. That's what he's reacting against, right? Am I remembering that correctly? That somewhere he writes later about this time in the Philippines, he has some sense of, this was part of my sort of evolution, my intellectual evolution, understanding as a relatively young man about how the world works and my place in it. And he's looking at that experience and also his time in Harvard to say, I had some unlearning to do, and this was part of my work going forward. And I myself was miseducated. And so I know that for sure. And that was some of the impetus for writing this education, because he was referencing some personal experiences. Was that in this education somewhere else?
Yeah. Page 152 of this education of the Negro. Yeah.
We're going to stop you right there. Okay.
They said it together, that was that part, but that's where it is. That's exactly it.
Are you saying that?
I'm saying that specifically.
Okay.
And it's right there in plain sight, right? That he's saying this is the moment, right? This is the time when I really, as you get started, it's that epiphany, the light bulb kind of goes off, and I realize, man, because the way he describes it in that thing, it's like Filipino students, they were talking about George Washington, but then they talk about Jose Rizal, and they sparked up, right? So it's pedagogy in a lot of ways was inspired by his times there, seeing the difference between the colonial education and the emancipatory education. Yeah.
But he wanted to learn.
Want to go back to the Philippines right until 19, what is it? Yeah, right at the end, right, 1912. And so Harvard was a stopping point. Harvard was a way to get a bigger salary. And that salary, by the way, to give you a sense, Filipinos live on $100 a month now, right? Poverty is hard. You know, $1,200, hundreds of years, that was a big salary, right? It's a big jump, and you can't discount that. A lot of the black soldiers, sharecroppers, the idea that why join the military? You know, military archives in what was that, like Carlisle, right? And look at black soldiers there. Black soldiers who were in the Spanish American War, Philippine American War. Why'd you go? He's like, they were hired. I was broke. I had problems at home. Jim goes on me. They're hiring me. It pays more money. And you could say the discourse I'm pushing back against on all of this in some ways is the idea: how could you work with the Filipino argument? How could you possibly support the empire that sent you at home, right? And my response is: would you be supporting the empire less by sharecropping? Would you be supporting the empire less by teaching? Like our stuff is empire is everywhere. Empire is just water. American empire is everywhere. There's no job you can take that is, you know, completely devoid of this. It's just degrees of that. Yeah, I think there are degrees. Could be wrong. Right? Pick up a gun and shoot somebody. It's a whole different thing. Going to a college school, teaching someone. They're different, but you know, they're all compromised. Right? There's no easy way out to tell ourselves. You know what this university does? My God, right? I mean, we're all part of the empire. Unless you're pushing back against it, right? There's, you know, that same place to be. So that realization is also happening, right? There's no good answers here. There's no, you know, easy solution. There's no, here's the way out. Yeah, please.
Thank you such a lot. In the beginning, you mentioned that the Filipinos are very excited about the Filipino origin of Black History Month.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that? Where might you be excited about that?
So please go to the Philippines. Please go to the Philippines. The Filipino scholars, God, right? Anything Filipino, they love. If there's a connection to anywhere in the world, the Filipinos have a diaspora. Right? There's Filipinos in every part of the world, and they're there for all kind of 10% of the Philippine economy is overseas employment that comes back to the Philippines. And so one of the reasons it's popular is because it's in shred of Filipino history. It's the same in Hawaii. People are all, they love it, they embrace it, they want it. They're not like, oh, we don't want to. Hawaii is actually a little more resistant to the Philippines on certain ideas about certain just facts about plantation, for example. The idea that the article you guys read last time, right? The idea that the plantation system in Hawaii is this offshoot of afterlife of slavery. We don't like that in Hawaii because it's really as bad memory as bad in the vibes. But other things like African Americans in Hawaii, they love it, right? Philippines, they love it. And the reasons why, and I think that anti-colonial stuff is still there. They obviously love Black culture. You see Steph Curry jerseys everywhere. I see Filipinos playing basketball and flip-flops with Steph Curry. Hip hop music. I mean, I was in the Philippines, walking in like that. There was I guess it's an informal settlement, right? So it's technically a slum over there. Walking down, I look on the sign, I see graffiti. The graffiti says "Bone Thugs and Harmony," the hip hop. And I asked my Filipino friends, like, what's up with that? Like, why Bone Thugs and Harmony? All these hip hop, Tupac, not Bone Thugs and Harmony. And they said there's a line in Bone Thugs and Harmony. I don't know if you remember it. It's where he goes, "I'm gonna miss everybody. I'm gonna miss everybody." If you listen to that and you're a native Tagalog speaker, what you hear is, "I'm going to eat 7 lions. I'm going to eat 7 lions." Goes, yes, he's talking Filipino. He's eating lions. This is the best song I've ever heard. So they love that. They get it, right? And yeah, I think what the pushback is, at least my project, why the practice part I go with, right? And everybody I talk to in the Philippines knows someone who's back in the Philippines. So we know there's at least 3,000 African Americans at this time who went and never came back. At least it probably as high as 10,000. And some of them are in very prominent positions and are very well known as Afro Filipinos, right? I have a friend who's doing an autobiography, actually. She's Afro-Filipino herself, from the Philippines, looks black, her whole life experience there. Everybody knows an Afro-Filipino in the Philippines, right? So it's not really that. The Filipinos in the diaspora often ended up, grew up in LA, lived 3 doors down from the Philippines, mostly my neighborhood, but Filipinos are right in the mix kind of constantly. And so there's a bigger transnational kind of diaspora meets diaspora kind of thing going on that I think people there instinctively sort of get it. But I wish I had a better answer, but it's show, check it out.
To follow up on actually that point too, actually, because I'm right, I'm thinking a lot about the military and thinking about, and this isn't necessarily about Woodson, but more so like the broader project. Because your last answer to Devontae's question made me think about the sexual politics of the military and thinking about, right, you say that about at least 3,000 black male soldiers never go back, right? And we see the story a lot in Korea and Japan, and the list goes on, especially in Asia and around the world, of course. But just generally, we have these obviously black men either stay or they end up impregnating these Asian women from across East Asia and such, and so pretty much what I'm getting at is, does your work kind of nudge at kind of like the meanings of that? Because when I think about the Black Pacific, I'm not only thinking about these intellectuals that we were talking about before, some Kevin's questions, but I'm also thinking about the military is very much a part of this apparatus, right? When you think about colonization, a lot of this is also military backed, right? So I'm just generally curious about, does your work with your forthcoming book kind of engage with some of that aspects as well? Because I'm hearing it, but I'm not hearing explicit.
It literally got cut out. We get uncut version of this. It's part of the stuff that got cut. It's too long.
Okay.
There's 2 books on this. One is by Tess Wilkerman, who is looking at kind of exactly what you're talking about in the Philippine-American War, where American soldiers come and she uses this as a sexual conquest, right? The part of the empire, part of what it does, it's about men to think they should have unadulterated access to the bodies of colonized women, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the project. You see that anti-massacre. I mean, all that's happening in 1903 or so. It's her book. I mean, heavily on. I think she's right on. The other book on this, which is more complicated in a lot of ways, the World War II story. That's our friend Sonia Gomez. Sonia Gomez is at University of Santa Clara. Santa Clara. She wrote this thing on Japan, basically, black soldiers in Japan. She's looking at kind of war brides, the idea of black men bringing Japanese women home and all the complexities of these Japanese women, living segregated kind of Jim Crow, and black men in Japan. And so it's all there, and I think, it's been done, right? And in terms of the sexual kind of components of empire, and the way in which even manliness and Teddy Roosevelt and all that stuff is one of the leading explanations for why America goes to overseas empires, to prove their manliness, prove their masculinity. The Civil War was over, now they can beat up on the Spanish and feel manly. It's part of the story, but the other part is they're looking for a place to dump black people. It's the other reason they go explicitly to empire. Empire builders explicitly are going to Hawaii to replace slavery, to deport African Americans who are in the Philippines. And then when the Philippines happens, that's another conversation, right? I should be in the Philippines, but because it can be a site of mass black colonization to get rid of problematic Negroes, right? Mm-hmm. So there's so many factors to why American empire does what it does. My contribution is not the sexual side, but it's the side of it's slavery. Like slavery is one of slavery that's afterlife. So one of the reasons America is treated at this time. It's one of the afterlives of slavery. It's one of the causes of that.
Okay, can I follow up too? How far back, like with the chronology of your book, you're talking about the afterlife of slavery, right? But how far back did you start?
1840 in Hawaii.
In Hawaii.
I started Reconstruction in 1840 in Hawaii.
Okay.
And they read it. This is last year. I said to you. Yeah,
hell yeah.
It's chapter 1. It's
I'm excited. I know y'all into it.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. I'm from sociology department, so I'm really grateful to be here. Could you go back to the slides of the McDonald's?
Mm-hmm. This one.
No, this one.
Yes.
So there's something in the picture that's McDonald's dream team that really caught my eye, and it says by Black History Makers of Tomorrow.
Yeah.
And at the start of your talk, you said something about contributions into the source. And I'm interested in kind of hear your thoughts on that, because there's something about the delayed contribution, right? It's like the tomorrow, as if it's delayed. It's kind of they're making contributions, but it's kind of this future thing. And growing up in a country where my parents always tell me when they tell me to do something, and I said I'm gonna do it tomorrow, they always say tomorrow will never come. And so that kind of stood out to me in terms of the contributions are there, but it's delayed, it's further. And then he talks about this notion of contributions to the sports. And I'm just trying to kind of hear your thoughts on kind of link this in terms of even the notion of the Black contribution being something that's kind of put off, right? It's coming. It's there, but it's that big there, yeah.
And you read it, extension with, this is this part right here, right? Enduring. Why do you need enduring? Oh, well, because there's this weird acknowledgement. There's no redemption. There is no going back. There is no salvation, right? And it's just always this enduring hope. You just gotta keep striving. Everybody's over. Anti-blackness is going to continue. What are we doing? So I think that's the way in which this discourse is kind of operating, right? Is that you're going to make a contribution. That's contribution to what, right? And then that contribution is going to have to keep coming. We're going to extract more and more and more contributions. And remain hopeful, don't argue with you, follow the law, don't protest, right? Just keep going. So the way in which, the other thing I was thinking about too is on the discourse of contributions. What if you don't contribute? Because I want to contribute. I don't want to contribute to anything. I want sleepless reparations, right? I want to not produce. I want to not be part. I want to check out of the system of racial capitalism. This is Tom Holtz's work on Jamaica, on colonial Jamaica, who says the biggest freedom, real freedom to just check out of racial capitalism is a threat to capitalism. It's a threat to the Western world. You can't just be free. You can't just do nothing. You have to be compelled to work. So that's why you have to contribute. I just had coffee with a student before this. I told her she's doing 50 million, she's amazing. I do 50 million things. I'm like, I love the amazing things you do. I love the energy. Make sure you sleep. Make sure you rest. Don't be compelled to have to produce everything, contribute. Because there's a whole bunch of people who don't decide to bless their life, right? We're not, single moms on welfare aren't being put on that. Why not, right? I want the single mom on Black welfare to be put on Black History Month, which would be a contribution, right? But that's not registered as a contribution. That's seen as, oh, you're not producing, you're not doing nothing, you're just, right? So there's a weird way in which that compulsion is shaming a whole bunch of people in a way that is really, I think, counter-revolutionary. And it's also nothing about issues of wealth and proletariat and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah.
You brought up Greg Carr earlier, real quick. He has this really interesting lecture that's on YouTube where he talks about this kind of pivot point of Black history that goes from Carter G. Woodson to Alfred Knopf kind of tapping Donald Franklin to create, the road from slavery to freedom, right? And so I wonder if there's an interesting kind of through line of this integrationism of Black history because if I'm not mistaken, the first edition or the earliest editions of From Slavery to Freedom, the textbook is coming out in the 40s, something like that, right? But that's also kind of when Woodson dies within the next decade, right? So I'm also thinking about where is ultimately From Slavery to Freedom, the kind of narrative and the flow of it is a flow that is not the Woodsonian version of, right? And Jarvis Gibbons has this new book that's out in today, right? And he talks about how effectively, without saying it, that John Franklin version is not really that 100-year version that Woodson created with Negro history, right? So that's something to also think about too with this, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's Negro History Week was supposed to be a capstone project, right? It was supposed to be study Black History 365. Gerald Blackstone would be all the materials. Negro History Week, you showcase what you learn. Not that you're gonna only learn it here, right? You're gonna learn throughout the year and you're going to showcase it, right? So yeah, it's a very, very different thing than, again, literal integration that ends up being put into this narrative with a redemptive arc, right? This slavery to freedom is a redemptive arc, and it's one that America loves because it gets to celebrate the freedom part, forget about the slavery part, we have overcome, right? And what are you complaining about? You got freedom, right? Which is why Hartman is so sorry. We'll talk about Hartman. Hartman is so important because she's disrupting all that. And she's saying, no, all these continuities in your own work is kind of showing, right? Between all the spaces between unfreedom, there's like a spectrum of unfreedom, a spectrum of enslavement, and then enduring kind of connection between blackness and enslavement on an ontological level, on kind of visual level. There's so many ways in which that narrative is becoming disrupted. I don't think Woodson would have, I don't know, he didn't, I don't think he would have approved. I mean, he was there, doing what he could, but, came around to it.
Yeah, I was also thinking about like on the topic of contributions and having the lack of contributions, which makes them kind of valueless in the terms of like what people tend to think about in Black History Month. Also thinking about contributions that aren't rendered as positive to American colonialism, especially thinking about the Alston illustrations and how just so much of Woodson's life was kind of chipped out of that. And I don't remember your exact wording when you were showing the archives, but saying that it was like the first time presenting this or like showing this, and wondering with that, is that just because the archives have been overlooked, or just like genuinely first time they've been found, or thinking about how different parts of people's lives can be present in the archives that entire time, and then it takes maybe 100, 200 years for someone to actually pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the historiography of Woodson biography, which biographers, some of them use phrases like first time in the Philippines. It's things like preparing for life's work. Chapters titled preparing, you're not doing any real work with them. You're just preparing for life's work. Now, part of it is we just don't have a lot. There was a fire. With a lot of wood, so love that about Woodson on his early period, especially. It's gone. So there's a what do you call it? What's that thing called? Like a newness bias, right? There's a bias towards the fact that it's the new building. Survive. The 1903 stuff, the Philippines, damn, those letters going across the Pacific, it's just not there. And so I think I kind of stumbled upon Woodson, but I wouldn't intentionally looking for because I knew it was in the Philippines. Because I was doing this Black Pacific project, I went to the National Archives of the U.S. This stuff is so deep there. It's in the military stuff. You get to the War Department. No doing a Woodson biography. It's one of the U.S. War Department archives. Yeah, just
Yeah, but there was still seemed to be an awareness that he was in the Philippines doing work there and was there for a certain amount of time.
Yeah,
but that was still overlooked anyway.
It was just kind of like preparing for life's work.
Yeah, and also like no question. It's like, how do you feel about that time? No, it's just part of the bigger, like, that later last.
It's a weird way in which that Americanist, right, plays into the fact that no one's really dug until now to see the man. It's his second choice. He very easily could have been a lifelong teacher in the Philippines. That's what he wanted. If they'd have been a salary to him, he's gone, right? And it's going to be a whole different Black history. It's going to be a whole different history of Black history. Everything is different. And so, yeah, it's just the way in which you think transnationally, you think kind of about different Afro-peripheralism, which is Canadian poet, Afro-Canadian poet, and Compton, who talks about Afro-peripheralism. That if you want to get what we need to get at now, you look at the periphery of Blackness itself, in places like the Philippines, right? These weird kind of sites that you might not think Blackness is front and center. And when you go there, you realize, wait a minute, we're dealing with these facts, just biographical facts. Really rework Woodson in my mind. It's like, wait a minute, Black nationalists, it's written a bounce on America. This is a different, we've told ourselves a story about Woodson that is really partial, and asking why, right? Do we not want to incorporate this? And people will not be too happy about, no, there's no way the Philippines or Philippine kids possibly, Black history. I get it, right? No, I think it's bigger, it's beautiful than that. It's like, you need to give the referee in that core, I think, here. And that's kind of just a cool stuff.
Thank you. That's a great place to end. Thanks again.